Good afternoon and welcome to the National Public Webinar on the Draft Section 179B Demonstration Guidance. My name is Ashley Keys and I work in EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, Air Quality Policy Division. I'll be co-presenting today with Baron Henderson of the Air Quality Assessment Division. The purpose of this webinar is to highlight key portions of the draft guidance, including background information and new policy and technical recommendations to facilitate meaningful stakeholder feedback. As a reminder, we posted this draft guidance for public review and comment on January 9th, and the comment period docket is open until March 10th. And as noted in the draft guidance, I'll start out with a caveat that this is just draft guidance that we're currently soliciting feedback on and does not constitute final agency action, nor does it create legally binding requirements on any party. So we'll start with a couple housekeeping items. We will keep everyone's lines muted to limit disruptions. Please feel free to enter your questions as we go along by switching to the Q&A tab, and I circled that in the bottom in red. And you can switch back to the presentation by clicking on the presentation tab. We will have time to answer questions at the end of the presentation. I'll note now that if you have highly technical or area-specific questions, we suggest you direct those to your EPA regional office contact, who will work with us on responding, since we likely will require more information than we can cover in today's national webinar to respond. Also, to see the slides larger, please use that expand screen icon circled in red on the upper right, and you can click it again to exit full screen and access the Q&A tab again. And these slides will be posted on our website after the webinar. First, I'll cover the purpose and scope of the draft guidance document. Then I'll highlight a few key pieces of background information and context as contained in the draft. Lastly, I'll cover the recommended process for air agencies to follow when developing and submitting a Section 179B demonstration to EPA. Then I'll turn it over to Baron to cover some of the more technical sections of the draft. And we'll have relevant links and our contact info at the end with the time for questions. Just 1 second, we're having technical. Everyone, please make sure to have their lines muted. Getting some feedback noise. Thank you. Moving on to slide 4. The purpose of the draft guidance is to assist air agencies considering a Section 179B demonstration for their non-attainment area if the area would be able to or would have been able to attain the relevant National Ambient Air Quality Standard, or NAAQS, by the attainment date but for emissions from outside the U.S. The draft guidance document contains new policy and technical recommendations that states should consider when developing a Section 179B demonstration, specifically on the types of technical analyses that air agencies should consider and the process and schedule an air agency should follow when developing a Section 179B demonstration. In an effort to provide a comprehensive guidance document, we also compiled all the relevant background information, such as statutory provisions and previous regulatory interpretations or requirements from other Clean Air Act programs in the draft. I think everyone should be able to see the slides. We will work on it as we go. In Section 1.2 of the draft guidance, we explain that Section 179B provides EPA with authority to consider air agency demonstrations of impacts from international emissions in two contexts. First, at the implementation plan review stage, and second, after each applicable attainment date. Specifically, in the first context, Section 179B a uses forward-looking language or prospective language that the plan would be adequate to attain and maintain the standard by the attainment date, but for international emissions. So we term this first instance as a prospective demonstration. Prospective demonstrations typically involve modeling of future air quality. These demonstrations should be submitted prior to or as part of the overall SIP submission. In the second context, Sections 179B b through b for ozone, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter respectively use backward-looking or retrospective language that the area would have attained the standard by the attainment date but for international emissions. So we've termed this second instance as a retrospective demonstration. Retrospective demonstrations typically involve analysis of past air quality. These demonstrations should be submitted after certified air quality data are available, indicating the area failed to attain by the attainment date. Also in Section 1.2 of the draft guidance, we reiterate the regulatory relief provided by Section 179B of the Clean Air Act. An EPA-approved prospective demonstration provides relief from the requirements to demonstrate future attainment. An EPA-approved retrospective demonstration provides relief from reclassification to a higher classification, also known as a bump-up. This regulatory relief is specified and limited by the statutory language, so EPA approval of a Section 179B demonstration does not relieve air agencies with non-attainment areas of having to meet the remaining applicable planning or emission reduction requirements of the Act. In Section 3 of the draft guidance, we clarify other available forms of regulatory relief provided by different Clean Air Act programs that are sometimes mistakenly attributed to Section 179B. Specifically, Section 179B relief is limited to non-attainment area requirements, though it does not provide for relaxation of any other planning or control requirements applicable to the non-attainment area. Section 179B does not provide for exclusion of monitoring data influenced by international transport unless it qualifies specifically under the exceptional events rule. It does not provide for redesignation to attainment without meeting the requirements of Section 107D3. It does not provide for reclassification to a lower classification, and it does not provide for relief of the interstate transport obligations under Section 110A2D. Section 3 also provides further detail on other regulatory mechanisms available for air agencies to consider, such as an attainment date extension or an exceptional events demonstration. I'm on slide 7 now. Here the guidance reiterates as background two key interpretations that were most recently described in the SIP requirements rule for the 2015 ozone standard. Specifically, we've twice affirmed in separate rulemakings our interpretation that Section 179B relief is not restricted to areas adjoining an international border. Additionally, we have previously affirmed our interpretation via rulemaking that Section 179B relief is not limited by an area's classification. Therefore, if applicable, marginal ozone non-attainment areas may submit retrospective demonstrations to avoid reclassification to moderate. As previously mentioned, an approved prospective demonstration provides relief from the requirement to demonstrate future attainment. Marginal ozone non-attainment areas are already not subject to this requirement, so a prospective demonstration for a marginal ozone area would not yield any regulatory relief. We don't expect to receive any Section 179B prospective demonstrations for marginal ozone non-attainment areas. In previous rulemakings, we've stated that the best approach for evaluating the potential impacts of international transport on non-attainment is for states to work with EPA on a case-by-case basis to determine the most appropriate information and analytical methods for each area's unique situation. Similarly, we will evaluate every Section 179B demonstration on a case-by-case basis. As described in the draft guidance, And as we'll cover in the later slides, there are many available analyses and tools for agencies to consider when crafting their demonstration. Each analysis constituting a line of evidence in the overall weight of evidence analysis. We expect to evaluate each individual line of evidence separately and as a whole. The strength of each piece of evidence is evaluated in the context of that case. A demonstration may still be approvable even if not all lines of evidence are clear or strong. Some lines of evidence may be much clearer than others. We continue to offer early coordination so that air agencies have the benefit of EPA's understanding of international transport and to expedite demonstration development and review and ideally avoid wasted resources or late hits. So we strongly encourage early engagement with your regional office throughout the development process. In Section 1.4 of the draft, we note that the air agency should also consider and examine any contradictory evidence to include in the demonstration. Such evidence, for example, may include data indicating that NAAQS exceedances could be predominantly attributed to domestic sources. As mentioned, EPA will weigh the body of available evidence to determine whether it collectively indicates that the SIP would be adequate to attain the NAAQS or the area would have attained the NAAQS but for international emissions. As shown here, Section 6.4 on page 42 of the draft guidance includes an example conclusory statement for agencies to include in their demonstrations after they have compiled the necessary evidence to support their conclusion. The draft guidance also lays out the recommended process for air agencies to follow when considering a Section 179B demonstration and when developing the demonstration. This flow diagram, found on page 4 of the draft guidance, depicts the overall general process. The first step being a discussion between the air agency and the region to discuss the conceptual model, which is the basis of the demonstration that we'll cover in more detail later in the webinar, and whether Section 179B is the most appropriate regulatory relief mechanism for the area. Then the air agency begins developing the technical demonstration. Again, we encourage early engagement with the regional office along the way, including sharing a draft demonstration before finally submitting the demonstration to EPA for action. The red circles here indicate steps that clearly involve early engagement and discussion between the air agency and EPA. The guidance also includes more detailed process flow diagrams for each type of demonstration. In Section 4.2.3 on page 13 of the draft, we have the flow diagram for prospective demonstrations, and Section 4.3.4 on page 16 of the draft for retrospective demonstrations. The draft guidance also lays out EPA's recommended procedure for an air agency's public comment process when submitting Section 179B demonstrations to EPA. In Section 7 on pages 42 and 43 of the draft, we recommend that air agencies conduct and document a public comment process for all Section 179B demonstrations, and that air agencies include comments received and the agency's responses to those comments as part of the demonstration. In the case of a prospective demonstration, this would likely be conducted as part of the public comment process on the overall attainment plan. In the case of a retrospective demonstration, which are typically a standalone submission, we recommend the air agency conduct a demonstration-specific public comment process to include in its standalone submission to EPA. Next, we will turn to the technical sections of the guidance, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Barron.
All right. Again, my name is Barron Henderson. I'll be covering the technical content. We're going to start with a slide that provides some context. In this case, we're talking about background, not specifically 179B just yet. Background typically is considered the sum of all sources that are not within a particular jurisdictional boundary, and so that would include natural sources, both local and transported, as well as, in the case of the U.S., the international transported anthropogenic emissions. Section 179B demonstration should focus on the non-U.S. anthropogenic emissions as illustrated by the red ovals on this slide. So that includes the transported from near range, like Canada and Mexico, as well as potentially from the longer range sources on the left. The draft guidance recommends focusing on the anthropogenic sources of emissions when developing a 179B demonstration. As further discussed in section 1.3 of the draft, this is consistent with the planning requirements for non-attainment areas as identified in subpart D of the Clean Air Act. Technical analyses should focus on the contribution from non-U.S. anthropogenic sources as opposed to non-anthropogenic sources on either side of the border. Let's go to the next slide. The framework of a demonstration will depend strongly on the conceptual model for a particular 179B demonstration. The draft guidance recommends producing a conceptual model that helps to illustrate how the 179B demonstration hangs together. The next two slides are going to cover examples of information to be included in a conceptual model, and there's more details in section 5 on pages 17 and 18 of the draft guidance. So, for example, you would want to include information about the attainment and classification of an area and the monitors in that area. It would be important to describe the monitors that are in the area more generally, where they are, for example, in a map would be useful. It would also be useful to identify key differences between measured exceedances that are influenced by international emissions and those that are influenced by local emissions. One example would be a table of that type of information. Go to the next slide. In addition, a conceptual model could include a summary of meteorological and atmospheric conditions that lead to high concentrations on monitor days that are influenced by the international anthropogenic emissions, and compare or contrast that to the days that are not influenced by international anthropogenic emissions. Identification of specific international anthropogenic sources, that might be a specific emitting facility, or source regions, which might be a city that is proximate, can be very useful in framing the conceptual model. Where available, a description of how controls on those upwind international sources differ from those within the United States is very useful. Once you have a conceptual model, that's really, again, as I said, going to frame the overall technical analysis. In many cases, some of the information that I used to describe the conceptual model so far was obviously informed by some technical analyses, and so it's not necessarily a linear process. You may be moving along and find that you update your conceptual model based on the analyses that you're doing. But in this case, the diagram on the right is showing you that the conceptual model is used to contain the different lines of evidence and provide a context for interpreting those. So then the lines of evidence that are included within a demonstration include observational, and that would be ambient composition and meteorological analysis, comprehensive emission analysis, meteorological analysis, which really falls within the ambient side, and then modeling analyses or modeling results. Within any one of those bins, there are multiple lines of technical evidence that could be provided, and the number of lines of evidence that are going to be used will depend on the complexity of the conceptual model. So a conceptual model that is less complex may use fewer lines of evidence to support it, whereas a more complex model is going to need more lines and strength of evidence to support it. All of those different lines of evidence then, as was said once before, are going to be evaluated separately, but then weighed together in total. In trying to understand whether your conceptual model is more complex or least complex, the draft guidance provides some information about how to make those decisions. For example, a conceptual model that might require fewer lines of evidence may have monitors that are being affected near an international border. There may be large international emission sources located approximately across the border near those affected monitors. The meteorology and international transport patterns that connect emissions on days identified as internationally influenced would be clearly represented. And then exceedances that are influenced by local sources would not occur under the same meteorological conditions. Excuse me. By contrast, a conceptual model would need more lines of evidence if the monitors are not located near an international border, if there are not specific international sources that are being identified or are too difficult to identify. Exceedances on internationally influenced days are also in the range of the typical exceedances that are attributed to local sources, that is, that they're not clearly identifiably different by their magnitude or dates. And exceedances occurred in association with other processes and sources of pollutants, or on days where meteorological conditions were conducive to local pollutant formation. So this would be a conceptual model where the exceedances are not clearly and immediately distinct, and therefore it would require more lines of evidence. On the next few slides, I'm going to be showing what some of those lines of evidence might look like, and I'll start with the ambient observational analysis. So that might start with a day-of-year analysis and a table of percentile ranked days. So you would take a monitor and you would look at the values and you would identify what types of years the exceedances occurred on and what type of day of year the exceedances affected by international sources were affected by. In addition, you could look at the coincidence of high pollution and meteorological or air quality conditions that are characteristic of international transport. So for example, when well-known international transport phenomena are associated with exceedances, these results support the weight of evidence. So if you were, for example, near a border and you had winds that were crossing that border and clearly connecting the monitor to emission sources upwind, that would be a well-known international transport phenomenon. A more complex analysis might be an air mass history analysis, and that might involve wind roses or backward trajectories or backward dispersion modeling. And when a large majority of hourly back trajectories or dispersion identify approximate international source or source region, these results would support the weight of evidence. Now, I wanted to highlight from some ambient observations why we believe that border proximity is likely associated with the level of complexity of a conceptual model. In general, near border areas have less complex conceptual models for reasons shown on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have the in-domain Mexico and Canada contributions to monitors within the U.S. from some modeling that was done here at the EPA. The citations are in the draft guidance. And you can see a clear and distinct relationship between the Canada and Mexico contribution and the distance from the border. Because those distances are quite short, it's easy to connect from a meteorological analysis standpoint, and the trajectory or backward dispersion estimates are reasonably interpreted as related to the effect. Other areas are going to have more complex conceptual models, and one reason, for example, would be if you're comparing emission magnitudes. Those comparisons have less meaning when the sources are at very different distances from the monitor. In addition, hemispheric transport may be required to connect those emission sources to the surface monitors that are being evaluated. And so in those cases, you're typically going to need full emissions chemistry, transport, and deposition, and evaluation of those processes to understand the connection of international sources to your monitors. So now I'm going to show you an example, and in this particular example that I'm showing, the evidence is not jumping out as immediately obvious. What I'm showing here is a table of days on which international transport has been identified, and I'll start actually with the figure on the right. The figure on the right shows measured ozone concentrations as a function of day of year on 5 years worth of observational records. And the days in red are days where we did an example analysis ourselves and came to the conclusion that those days might be considered as having international influence. As you can see, a lot of the red dots appear clustered around other green and blue dots. The blue dots were not evaluated as to whether or not they were internationally impacted, and the green dots were and found to not be internationally impacted. So they're not jumping off the page as being distinct, which is important information. But if, for example, the days that were internationally influenced had all clustered, for example, between 0 and 50 on the day of the year, they would have clearly been distinct from the other ambient observations. These tables come from page 28 of the draft, and more information about them is available there. Here are some additional ambient analyses from previous demonstrations or demonstrations that were submitted. On the bottom left-hand side, there's wind direction. This is from a Nogales PM10 demonstration. And just because we're showing these example analyses doesn't mean that we're necessarily supporting them. But in this case, what you see is non-exceedance days on the left and exceedance days on the right. And from the wind trajectory analysis, you can see that there is a stronger predominance of southerly winds when just looking at the exceedance days compared to looking at all days, and they tend to have slower wind speeds. So that information was being used to suggest that there was a southerly connection to exceedances and therefore to an international contribution. In the upper right, the bar plot that we're looking at there has 3 monitors, Brawley, El Centro, and Calexico, sorted by distance from the border, so Brawley being the furthest and Calexico being the nearest. And what they're showing us here is that the observations at Brawley in 2001 were fairly high, but in 2012 they had reduced pretty dramatically, and the same is true at the El Centro monitor. But by the time you get near to the border, those reductions between 2001 and 2012 are not happening, which is suggestive in general that controls that were effective in Brawley were not similarly effective near the border, suggesting an international impact. The figures on the bottom right come from a mass balance, chemical mass balance, or PMF analysis, which are identifying individual sources based on a chemical fingerprint. And the days on the left have a much smaller contribution from refuse burning than the ones on the right. The refuse burning in that case was associated with an international refuse burning that was known to be occurring, and so that type of ambient observational analysis would be supporting an international contribution. On the next slide, we're going to move on to the comprehensive emissions analysis, which is going to be used to answer questions like, what emission sources currently exist on both sides of the border, the magnitude of domestic versus international emissions? What controls might currently be in place for the international sources? This information may be very difficult to find, so that's where available. In addition, what changes in international is expected in the foreseeable future, which one might get from trends data that are readily available? And then also, are there international agreements that are already addressing these emissions? So might there be expected changes in the future due to binding international agreements? We're going to go to the next slide, and this slide is showing an example from a previous demonstration. This is the Nogales non-attainment area for PM10. And what it shows is the emission inventories for 2008 and 2011 for Nogales in the first row. And in the second row, it shows an estimate of the international Nogales municipality in Mexico. Because they were less confident in the Mexico inventory, they actually provided several different estimates. From this, we can look at the comparison of the local versus near-border international emissions to understand what we might expect to be the contribution from international sources. In this case, they show that the range of emissions might be 64 to 82% in 2008, and somewhere between 64 and 83% in 2011. So because this is a nearby municipality, this is evidence that could be considered. And when those emission inventories show large emissions in a nearby international metro area, This can support the weight of evidence that international emissions are contributing to exceedances. Now I'm going to talk about the modeling analyses, which can be considerably more complex. We'll start with photochemical grid modeling. We're starting with photochemical grid modeling because it's the most generally applicable technique. It can cover both primary and secondary sources. It can cover near sources as well as long-distance sources. There are several different ways to use photochemical models to attribute, whether it be international sources or local sources. One can attribute by zero-out simulations or by source apportionment technologies. When we attribute with the photochemical grid modeling and internationally attributed concentrations are large compared to U.S. contributions, these results are going to support the overall weight of evidence. One could also use dispersion modeling. This would be more useful when there's a single or a few nearby international sources that contribute inert pollutants, that is, for example, primary PM, so non-reacting pollutants. And in this case, you would do attribution using single source concentration estimates from the dispersion modeling. When you do single source concentrations and cumulatively sum them for the international sources, then if the cumulative international contributions are large compared to the U.S. sources, then these results would support the weight of evidence. So receptor modeling is shown under modeling, but you've actually already seen the figures from it. These were the chemical mass balance or the PMF style analyses that were shown previously. Those were the pie charts showing a large impact of refuse burning. These are useful really for PM2.5 or previously potentially for PM10. And they can be used when the international sources have distinct chemical profiles, that is, that the emissions coming out of sources that you're identifying as both international and contributing to your exceedances emit different chemical species than the sources that you have locally. The attribution to those international sources is done using chemical mass balance or PMF or principal component analysis. And when those chemical fingerprints support international sources that are distinct from local sources, then these results support your overall weight of evidence. On the next several slides, I'm going to show some examples, and I'll show an example of a meteorological analysis fairly soon, but I'm going to start by putting it in the context of a conceptual model. We'll start with a less complex conceptual model. This would be the case, for example, along the border. The example that I'm using here comes from Mexicali emissions in Mexico, creating enhanced concentrations in Calexico, California. The figure on the left shows Calexico on the bottom, Calexico, California, and Mexico on the top. So you're looking from the United States into Mexico in this picture. One might expect a demonstration to include the observational analyses that we've discussed so far. In this case, you might have existing Mexico and California inventories. In this case, I'm showing an example of that on the bottom left figure. And one could use trajectory or backward dispersion modeling to link high days to Mexicali emissions. And I want to highlight, in this case, we're not looking at emissions from everywhere, but we're looking at the emissions that are international near the border. And in that case, we're hoping that the internationally influenced days are going to stand out and that they are clearly relevant to the standard. What has been done in demonstrations that have been submitted to us so far is that people have created adjusted design values that show attainment, which would be necessary but not sufficient for your weight of evidence. And then in a case like this, you could confirm the contribution that you're estimating from adjusted design values with pre-existing photochemical modeling. And the example that I'll use here is EPA's modeling that is publicly available. So we'll go to the next slide to look at what an example might look like. So the meteorological analysis for a less complex situation could use air parcel history analysis, or back trajectories or backward dispersion modeling are two examples of air parcel history analysis. In the draft guidance, we talk about pairing that information with anthropogenic emissions maps. So you can use normalized potential emission sensitivities developed from back trajectories and backward dispersion modeling, and you can multiply those by the emissions that you already have in this example, and try to understand what fraction of your emission sensitivity comes from U.S. sources or Mexico sources. And in this case, really highlighting the Mexicali influences. What we would do is we would take an hourly analysis, matching hours in the NACS metric, for example, the maximum daily 8-hour average for ozone. We'd take backward trajectories or dispersion modelings for all 8 hours being used in the average. And we'd be asking the question, does a large majority, for example, 75% of those hours pass over a nearby international anthropogenic emission? If so, then you would be able to say when a large majority of normalized potential source contribution are from an international source region, these results could be part of that evidence, or they would support the weight of evidence for the demonstration. To put that more succinctly, when the fraction of normalized potential source contribution is substantially larger than U.S. contribution, those days would be identified as being from Mexico, for example. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing 6 different days. The day in the top left has 20% from Mexico, which would mean a larger contribution from the U.S., whereas the bottom right figure has a very large contribution from Mexico, 85%. So a day like that would clearly be from or attributable more to Mexico. All right, move to the next slide. After you've identified your days that are attributable to Mexico and seen what your adjusted design value would be if you had removed those days, the difference between them would be what you're saying is your contribution from international emissions. And you would want to see whether or not that contribution is similar to what is readily available in public photochemical modeling. So in this case, we could take the contribution that's being estimated from the adjusted design value and compare it to the EPA's OSAP modeling that was used for the Casper closeout modeling, which is the figure on the right. When that overall contribution from air history analysis is smaller than the photochemical grid modeling, then that would generally support the idea that the estimate from air history analysis is correct. So that would be an example where you wouldn't be doing your own photochemical model, but you'd be confirming your other results from existing photochemical grid modeling. On the next slide, we would move to a more complex conceptual model, and in this case, in addition to the other analyses that you would do, you would need to do chemical transport modeling as the preferred approach for quantifying international contributions, specifically for compounds with secondary components in particular. For prospective demonstrations, the modeling should use the same base case and future year consistent with the SIP modeling. For retrospective demonstrations, the modeling should focus on the years used in the attainment evaluation. When long-range international impacts are being evaluated, you'll typically need to include a global or hemispheric simulation and couple that with a regional simulation. When these systems are put together, you will quantify the impact from international sources using a combination of either sensitivity analysis or source apportionment model runs. And the details of those are found in other guidance that is cited in 179B guidance. When the international emissions of focus cross scales, for example, from the global to regional modeling, the emissions need to be consistent between the two scales. You wouldn't want to have one emission inventory in your global scale and another emission inventory in your regional scales. Again, more details on how to do the photochemical grid modeling for source apportionment or for zero-out sensitivity modeling are included in the ozone PM 2.5 and regional haze modeling guidance, and so they're not discussed specifically here. I'm going to close out now just with how to comment on the draft Section 179B demonstration guidance. The EPA will be accepting feedback on the guidance through March 10th, 2020. Interested stakeholders can submit their comments to the docket, which is identified here. And specifically, we request input on areas that could use further explanation or clarification, and the slides from this webinar will be made available after the webinar. And with that, I'd love to open it up for questions for both Ashley and I.
Yeah, we're going to go to the Q&A tab, and we will be back on in just a second. Just a reminder to everyone that if you want to enter any questions for us, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom. And we, again, apologize for any technical difficulties for folks not being able to see the slides. Again, they'll be posted on our website after the webinar. It looks like we did get one technical question here from Clark County, Nevada, asking, does this guidance address international emissions from China?
So the guidance does cover international emissions in general, which would include China. China would fall into the more complex case that we've been talking about because it is not immediately proximate to the areas being considered. So because of that, for example, the total emission inventory of China would not be usefully compared to the emissions in a particular non-attainment area. And you would need the complex photochemical grid modeling to do the attribution.
Okay, just a reminder to folks that if you want to enter a question for us, use that Q&A tab at the bottom, and we will answer those verbally. Also, our contact information is available on that last slide, and we will be posting these slides on the website link that we've already shared via the Q&A tab. So feel free to contact us later. And again, the draft guidance is out for public comment right now, so feel free to submit comments via the docket as well. So it looks like we did get a question, can we speak more to the applicability to marginal areas? For example, would this be considered a SIP? So I did briefly cover that earlier. So for marginal areas, they would not already be subject to the requirement to demonstrate future attainment, which a prospective demonstration would provide relief from. So marginal ozone non-attainment areas would be able to submit a retrospective demonstration in order to be considered as getting relief from the reclassification requirement if they were not able to attain by the attainment date. And again, I mentioned this at the beginning, but if you have area-specific or highly technical questions, we encourage you to go ahead and direct those to your EPA regional office contacts, since they will be in the best position to answer those, and they will coordinate with us as necessary. Also, one point on that last question, that retrospective demonstration, as I mentioned, would be a standalone submission and not necessarily a SIP revision, but we did still recommend in the guidance that you conduct the regular public comment process on that and submit that to EPA. Since we haven't been getting any other questions, we will go ahead and wrap it up, and thank everyone again for joining us for this webinar today. And again, the slides will be posted on our website after the webinar. Thanks. Everyone have a great day.